Oh, fuck! No! That's crazy. Oh, fuck, that's crazy. No fucking way. Am I still on YouTube? The ninja. Oh my. I got logged out on OBS. I got logged out. Holy shit. Oh my god. No fucking way. Wait. Oh my god. Oh no. Oh no, dude. Wait a second. Oh my god. Guys, it says my account is suspended. Oh my god, that's fucking crazy. It's just like the way it happened was fucking insane, dude. Thank you for the sub. Well, as far as I'm aware, I was the first person in the world to stream Donkey Kong Bananza live on Twitch, and I did so 2 days before release. I want to say real quick, there was no funny business, no shenanigans. The shop that I bought from simply broke street date. I got my copy 2 days early, and I figured, okay, that would be a funny stream. That would be a very lucrative stream as well. There was a bunch of threads made about me on Family boards, Reddit, Reset Era, 4chan, unfortunately. Which, again, to me indicates I must have been the only person that people were really aware of that streamed the game. And it took the ninjas 4 hours to get to me. And yes, I was fully aware. I didn't sign an NDA or anything, of course, right? I just bought the game. But Nintendo's content guidelines, they do preclude you from uploading anything pre-release. So, fair play, I guess. But I'm back. My channel suspension has been lifted. And I figured, okay, now that I had all this extra time with the game before everybody else, I might as well try to finish it as fast as possible and give an early review. This is probably one of the earliest reviews you will see outside of the mainstream critic sphere. So I hope, as a big Nintendo 3D platformer fan, as a big Mario fan, Mario 64 is one of my favorite games, and as someone who's very excited for this one, I hope I can give you some unique insight there. Now, this game has many potential forebears. Obviously, prior DK games, the DKC trilogy on the Super Nintendo, the Returns games by Retro, 64, which was the only 3D game up to this point. We got, obviously, EPD Tokyo's own games. Their first game, in fact, being Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, so they have some history with the series as well, some really important foundational history. Obviously went on to make Mario Galaxy, 3D World, 3D Land, Odyssey, which is arguably the direct predecessor for this game. So it's all kind of going into this. But really, the comparison point that I want to start with, that I had to really think of, was Tears of the Kingdom, actually. My favorite moment in that game was getting to the Lightning Temple, which is this giant pyramid in the middle of the desert, and you enter it, and it's this pretty intricate, complicated structure. It has all these layers and intertwining paths. It is a very convincing Zelda dungeon in the middle of an open world, which on its face, is really cool. But then obviously clever players will surmise, hey, I got the Ascend ability, I can do some shenanigans with that, and wouldn't you know it, you can break all the way through the ceiling, and the outside world is still completely active. And I knew this is probably how it had to work, logistically, again from my exploration of caves, just from having used the Ascend ability prior, right? But something about that still blew my little mind. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with the idea of seamless interior to exterior and vice versa transitions. Even as someone who didn't understand the technological realities behind it, I sort of grokked, okay, this is fucking hard to do. This is something that games really, for many reasons, don't have a full grasp of. Just scope being unrealistic to make every interior walkable. The fact that streaming or AI or even lighting, all those things just can't transition so seamlessly between these styles of level design. As impressive as a game like Breath of the Wild, for example, to me was the fact that all these NPCs, they have their little routines. I can just walk into a house and I'm in the house. There's no loading time, especially compared to old Zelda. That's pretty crazy. And then even compared to like other RPGs, Witcher, Bethesda stuff, the towns are just seamlessly walkable. That is a pretty big step up. But then there is a sense of kind of boxiness and simplicity with these interiors, with these houses, especially when you get to Tarrytown, right? What this game is doing in that regard is next level. Obviously, you can surmise from the destruction mechanic, there's some relevance in that regard. But really, what impressed me is that every single environment feels truly like one big seamless mold. I don't really know exactly how to articulate that, but I really cannot think of another game that I played where 3D space was conveyed in this super natural, seamless way, where things are just constantly stacked on top of each other. You're constantly going down places and then going inside somewhere and then coming out some other way. I think one really useful comparison point is something like Rico Harbor in Super Mario Sunshine. Obviously, polarizing game, polarizing level design. But so often I got the sense of, wow, I'm going all the way up here and this whole world is still down there, and it is an intricately detailed 3D platformer world. It's not a barren open world like every fucking open world game. And again, I'm not saying that to like knock games like Breath of the Wild. I love Breath of the Wild. One of my favorite games. You could even make comparisons to urban environments like the GTA series, where again, it's these very static building blocks, buildings just being kind of pulled out from the ground. This truly feels, and again, I know I'm describing it kind of vaguely, but it's a sensation that's so hard to capture in words. You really have to see it to realize, wow, it feels like a designer's hand just very carefully molded every single pathway here. And obviously, there's a strong relation with the whole destruction mechanic where, guess what, every structure from the surface can become an interior, and it's totally seamless and very convincing. And again, when I'm thinking back to other kind of destruction-heavy games like Red Faction Guerrilla, for example, where the destruction was just limited to man-made structures, not the Mars surface itself, just buildings and such, which as it was, yeah, pretty impressive, right? But there's very rarely a sense of like, okay, the level designers are very deftly guiding you through 3D space, up and down, constantly. Now, I listed a bunch of possible touch points for this game earlier. Obviously, DK64 was in there, and I think then it's also fair to mention stuff like Banjo-Kazooie. I'm not a big fan of those games, right? But I think, as someone who did grow up with the Banjo games, I do have to say, something that really captured my imagination a lot as a kid was this kind of fantasy. This idea of like, wow, I can go all the way up to some tall structure, see all the way down, and then dive down or fly down and land in the water. And it's, again, this very, very seamless and intuitive method of interacting with a world. I feel like in the age of open world, that is something we so take for granted. But I think the difference between a vast blank slate that then has to be populated with stuff versus this, where it's these incredibly densely packed environments where, again, the pathing and the design guidance feels constantly intentional. It's really more reminiscent of, okay, take an old school 3D Zelda dungeon, like from Ocarina, right? And make that your entire level design philosophy. Extrapolate that to a full three-dimensional world where you're expected to get to vantage points, reason spatially, okay, where's my path forward? How do I get to this objective? I think if that's a fantasy that appeals to you, you need to check this out. I think in that's the one area where I thought this game was really special, even just past the obviously novel destruction gimmick, right? Which is deeply intrinsically tied with the style of level design, of course. But as someone who has a problem with games constantly stopping their forward momentum to make you do a little instanced environmental puzzle that, you know, facilitates exploration, right? That's what they consider exploration. I was saying this a lot with Tropical Freeze. Obviously, brilliant game, right? That game is very video gamey, very stop and go. This is constant forward motion. This feels like exploring the real world. I don't know how else to put it. Like, it's kind of nuts. I know this is an insane take about the 3D cartoon monkey game, but trust me, bro. Now again, that's something you kind of have to give the 3D collectathon lineage, that it was always kind of grasping at that idea, and I think Bananza fully seizes on it, fully realizes this idea. However, then the thing it also adds is like actual movement. It's just something that Nintendo is so naturally good at that we take it for granted. And I should say, I'm currently skeptical that this game will satisfy the tech fiends. I'm very curious to see how the speedruns are gonna look, but I feel like there's actually not much there for a couple of reasons. I will get into that. But from my gameplay, from what I've experienced, it doesn't strike me as particularly technical in terms of its movement. If you're looking for very nuanced interactions in a game like Mario 64, between the character, their physics, the environment, even just the friction of surfaces, the way that feels, the way you interact with slopes, I think that's something that Odyssey also seized upon pretty well. This game is very straight-laced. This game lets you accelerate very immediately, cancel very immediately into any direction. The roll instantly accelerates you to basically top speed. And again, you can roll in one direction, then instantly roll the other direction. You don't really have those types of momentum considerations. You don't seem to accelerate much on slopes. It is pretty simple in that regard. However, it's not Banjo-Kazooie. I think the fact that the roll is so instantaneous and so constantly actionable, you can throw it out basically nonstop. Matter of fact, one of the 4chan comments I got was that my playstyle was too erratic and made one person uncomfortable because I was rolling all over the place. It obviously keeps the DKC idea of, okay, I roll over a ledge, and then in the process I store a jump so I can jump in midair, and then you can do another roll in the air. It feels very, I'm gonna use the buzzwords, very smooth, very fast, very intrinsically fun. And as someone who recently played Donkey Kong 64, I feel like that's something that was sorely lacking from that game. It's definitely a flexible system that invites you to carve your own way, literally, through the environment, and find your own way past obstacles, and where every inch traveled. This sounds like so buzzwordy and cheesy, right? But is a joy. And I think it's really, again, you look at a game like this that's, like I said, not very technical seemingly, very, again, straight-laced in terms of movement, and you kind of take that for granted. But then you play stuff like, unfortunately, I think the Galaxies, right? Or even something like Astrobot, where just getting around in a basic sense doesn't really elicit much joy. It's not very pleasurable. And then that extrapolates to the idea that, okay, if I want to explore, it makes it just exponentially more tedious to do so. In this game, not the case. Now, the little bit of intricate environment interaction and potential tech that I discovered. Number one, when you pick up a chunk and then enter the turf surf move. So you have the chunk like this in your arms, you pick it up from the ground or from the wall, whatever, and you place it below your legs to surf. If you do that in the air, you get a big initial speed boost. And I feel like even without wanting to do the surf part of the move, right? You could instantly cancel it, but then you still keep that momentum. I think sometimes that can be useful. Maybe there will be some shenanigans with that. And then obviously there's a fun combo you can do where you pick up a chunk, turf surfing the air, go back to the normal pose, and then use the chunk to like do a double jump. I could see some funky stuff with that. However, there's like balancing considerations that I'll talk about. The other interaction that I kind of liked is that when you roll into a wall, DK will bonk his head against it and sort of fall down. So generally speaking, that means that if you're rolling toward a wall in midair, you want to be careful to space it out in a way where the roll animation ends by the time that you reach the wall so that you don't get the bonk, right? But then you can actually circumvent this by punching, which if you're doing that, you won't get the bonk, right? You won't fall down. But then that has the caveat of, okay, if the surface that I'm colliding with is pretty brittle, I might punch through it, and that can give me problems. So not like the deepest dynamic there, but it is something that happened to me a couple times that I have to be aware of. And I think it leads to our next point, the destruction. Now this is really interesting because when I really think about my time with the game and the challenges that I faced, I read the IGN review. And one phrase that I found really interesting and really apt, actually, was that, okay, it's not necessarily a game about just destroying stuff. It's a platformer where you can destroy stuff. And that's an important distinction because it's very rare that they make you carve your way through the environment necessarily. It's very rare that the game will straight up tell you, okay, punch your way through this wall just to get to the other side. It's much more often the case that you're faced with a platforming gauntlet of some kind where everything around you can break, and that is what creates the challenge. I was very early clued into this idea of, okay, you pick up chunks from the ground, you tear pieces off of the ground, DK holds them in his hands, and then you can use them to throw at enemies or other objects or what have you. So really, immediately I was imagining scenarios like, oh, you're on a relatively thin platform, you tear off chunks, and that's your ammo. The ground that you're walking on is also your ammo, and is limited. You may put yourself in a bad situation by carving out too much from the ground. And at its best, the game does really seize upon that. It does really have scenarios of that nature, and particularly there was like a couple boss fights. I don't want to spoil too much, but specifically the one in the forest area that is this floating target that jumps around all over the place in this big, seamless open world map in a way that is not prescribed at all. And it will shoot these vines at you, and then parts of the environment that sort of emerges you can walk on, and parts of it are dangerous. And you're breaking apart the vines bit by bit, gradually, again, dynamically. You're maneuvering around it, again, dynamically. You don't really know where it's going to appear and how it's going to interact with the rest of the world. That is such insanely forward-thinking, like, platformer design that I don't know if I've seen anything sort of similar in other games. There's a couple more similar bosses, and then there's other interesting elements where the different properties of the environmental materials sort of interact with each other. So you get what they call muck. It's just green goo, and it sort of softly bristles away if you throw sand at it. So when you want to deal with it, you want to be aware of, okay, where exactly am I taking chunks out of? Is it sand? Is it some harder material? If you grab a harder material, usually it will take DK longer to tear it out, which is also a consideration. There's bosses that will remove parts of the environment gradually based on your position, so you have to think ahead a little bit and try to minimize the damage by positioning yourself correctly. This is one of the later bosses. I'm not going to show footage of this, but if you get there, you'll know what I mean. And then when you get to stuff that leverages the destruction more explicitly, specifically in the form of, okay, you got these construction sites, tear them down as fast as possible. There's an easy time, there's a hard time, you get extra rewards for that. And I'm not gonna lie, there's one of those challenges where you use the Bonanza transformations, the big animals that you saw in the trailer, to tear down the environment. There's a couple points where some recurring game elements, mechanical elements, telegraph the type of transformation that makes sense here. For example, you have these wind shafts that push you upward, and at that point you know, okay, I gotta use the ostrich here and fly up. But that particular challenge I'm thinking of, it really wasn't obvious or clear, okay, this is the one that you're supposed to use here. You can kind of route out your own path. Yes, it was real routing. I had to make a strategy, okay? I'm gonna start as the Kong Bananza, take an explosive chunk here, throw it at this one precise location. Again, I have to carefully time it. Switch to the ostrich to get up, switch to the zebra to do this other thing. And it's all, again, like I said, organic, not prescriptive, and again, mechanically very novel. This idea of I have to play around all these vastly different material properties. You have vines that hurt you when you touch them, materials that are harder, that are softer, that you can stand on, that you can't stand on. There is some real ass sauce in this game. However, I want to say, most of the time, it is incredibly easy. The specific sensation that I had is like, this game isn't even trying to provide opposition to DK at all. It starts out, I want to say the first 3-4 worlds with these very tame obstacles where, okay, you go through a linear path, and I should say, okay, the big open levels, they have a critical path through them. It's not a collectathon where your progression is gated by open-ended secrets hunting or whatever. That is an element of the game, but it's not part of the main story progression. There is very simple get from A to B to C to D objectives. And I want to say the pacing in that regard, again, coupled with the level design, fucking immaculate. That's what made this game so easy to just blast through for me. I had a really hard time tearing myself away from it the last 2 days. But yeah, when you're on one of those linear paths, it's okay, DK goes through and there's like very classic platformer things kind of coming at you. But then because you can punch away to the side, or because the obstacles are just not that dense and pretty tame, generally speaking, and because your roll, cancel, jump shit is pretty all-encompassing, always useful, always powerful, gets the job done all the time, there's not really much that can kind of get in its way. I want to say, as a pure platformer, Mario Odyssey does much more to provide opposition, and that is also a famously easy game. Even just, I mean, you see the design challenge. It's very obvious on its face, right? The fact that, okay, if I can destroy most of the environment, how do I keep the player on a specific path? How do I make it so that, like, let's say there's a pillar here and there's a pillar here, and I want the player to go through here, right? In Mario Odyssey, that makes perfect sense, because, like, guess what? I can't, if I hit the pillars in mid-air, I just fall to my death, right? In Donkey Kong, I can climb the fucking pillars, I can punch through them. It's really difficult for the designers to introduce obstacles that are actually meaningful without undermining the fundamental system, right? Without undermining the fundamental ideas of climbing and destruction. And I think sometimes it does actually find the balance in really clever ways. For example, there are walls where you can climb them, you're just much slower, or I should say there's a force constantly pulling you down if you're not working against it. And that can get pretty interesting in terms of timing and positioning. But again, the game introduces all these elements pretty slowly and pretty cautiously. I almost want to say you could even look at, again, core movesets, right? With Mario, if I want to get a mid-air burst of forward momentum, I have to land on Cappy, right? I have to land on Cappy to make the save. And not the hardest thing in the world, but it's something. It's some tight positioning. In DK, I just press L2, right? I almost want to say that this game is much more complicated in terms of its mechanics and systems controls, but much easier as an actual obstacle course. I almost feel like that's conscious. It's interesting to consider that Odyssey was 7 years ago. You gotta consider there's so many kids, for them it was probably their first video game, one of their first video games. And now 7 years later, they're graduating to this much more complicated game. And you almost question, I mean, this is not really interesting in a review context, right? But I do want to voice this thought that, maybe they weren't super confident in players grasping this mechanical jump immediately, and they lowered the difficulty kind of accordingly. Who knows? But yeah, I think you see the contrast with the bosses really, really well. I just mentioned some of the highlights, of course. But then a lot of the bosses, very weirdly, they try to play keep away a little bit. They throw hazards at you, but it's pretty trivial to close in on them, and then they're basically dead in one combo. I think a couple of reviews already noted that there's a general shift from the standard Mario hit the enemy 3 times formula to, okay, most bosses just have health bars now, and it's not very prescribed a lot of the time when you can hit them. That sounds good at first. It's just that, like, what you're stuck with here mechanically can barely be classified as combat. The game doesn't really have systems to deal with you just punching the shit out of something, right? I know Grumpy Kong, for example, at some point he will charge up an attack, but it's pretty slow. Bosses don't really have countermeasures, way to dodge out of attacks. It's very, very simple, and I'm not gonna lie, the game just screams to be a hit the boss 3 times Mario game constantly. Because those bosses, ironically, are just the best ones. The most suited to mechanics. It's in those moments where you actually have to survive against the obstacle waves for extended periods of time. And then all the interesting dynamics come into play, right? With the semi-destructible terrain, with the different material properties that kind of clash and make your life harder. That's where really the sauce is. And I'm optimistic that a lot of that is present in the post-game as well, to a big degree. And I don't mean to say that the game gets good 20 hours in. That's not what I'm saying. I had a fucking blast. But I think to some extent, you have to be okay with the power fantasy of it. You have to be okay with enjoying it on that level, with the visceral feeling of navigating this very deftly constructed 3D space with this insanely powerful character. I guess I want to say on that note real quick, the Bananza transformations lean into that power fantasy really nicely, and there's some, again, I mentioned the construction site minigame. I thought the way I had to really route out and think about when to use which one, it was at its best there. And then there's even interesting subtle differences where that the game doesn't telegraph immediately, where, for example, the different Bananzas each have different weight classes, and the heavier weights will just break through thinner floors. So there's moments where, for example, the ostrich can hover, and you might be inclined to use that, but then guess what? You instantly collapse to the floor, and you were better off using the zebra maybe first, switching to... Actually, there's some transformations that I can't spoil that. I'm just gonna stick to the stuff that was in the trailer. But yeah, you could imagine, again, not prescribed, walk on the brittle floor with the zebra, and then at some point switch to ostrich after a jump, and you're good to go. All that is really sick. However, it seems really viable to over-rely on the Bananza transformations. The game is incredibly forgiving with the meter management of that. It can hardly be called that, to be honest. And especially some of the later upgrades that you get, it's hard to imagine the game not just completely buckling under the insane power of some of these transformations. Again, with the ostrich, the idea that I could fly over the entire level and totally trivialize it that way. Now, I wanted to be nasty. I wanted to, like, flex my shit a little bit, do much movement, consciously ignoring some of the mechanics of the game. To me, that's fun, and it's very viable, and it's not like a chore. And again, it's something that you can very naturally self-select as you're playing, right? It's not like it's dependent on grinding. It's not like it's dependent on fucking skilling your character a certain way, because it's not really an RPG. It does have a skill tree, but like the skill tree it totally doesn't matter. Like it's completely innocuous. It's really just the decision of, okay, I can tell that I'm supposed to do this with the zebra, but let me try to do it with like regular DK, you know? So yeah, for me, the pacing worked, the level design worked. Oh my god, I gotta say, okay, in terms of like geometry, level design, world construction, all that shit, what a friggin' step up from Mario Odyssey. Goddamn. I don't know if y'all remember the Trixie the Golden Witch Mario Odyssey graphics analysis, where she, I think, very correctly pointed out that there's something really wrong about the way Odyssey kind of looks and is constructed. It feels very geometric, very artificially constructed. You have these hills sort of pulled out from the ground and these very prescribed, very often repeating sort of rolling shapes and all that. This game is such an insane contrast from that. It is hard to believe that it's kind of the same team almost. Again, like I said, for me, this is the new benchmark for like very naturalistic, flowing 3D level design. I haven't seen it done to this standard really ever before. And from a team that previously made a game where it feels like level test rooms trying to pass as real worlds, that's kind of crazy. So yeah, that's my Bananza review. If I make it on time, I will be live on Twitch and YouTube by the time that you're watching this to check out some of the post-game. Nothing spoilery, don't worry about that. And beyond that, maybe consider checking out my Ko-fi page. It's linked in the description. I have a series called Backlog Battle over there where I just talk about all the games that I finished. We're on 3 episodes currently. Those reviews are much more chill, relaxed, but also aiming to be pretty detailed. And check out my stream, subscribe if maybe you joined in the whole Nintendo Ninja stream fiasco as well. Hey, hi, thank you for sticking around. I don't want to be a one-hit wonder. I don't want to be a one-trick pony. I hope that was not the height of my content fucking career over there. Yeah, I'll see you on stream.